Let's go back to Capitol Hill now, where the House will vote today on whether to end the government shutdown. Now, just moments ago, they took a break from session, and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
SNAP recipients, millions of SNAP recipients across the country that, whose access to food stability was imperiled. And we have to figure out what that was for, because you had both the capitulation in the Senate and you have the refusal and the outright cruelty among House Republicans and the White House, who went to court to try to sue for their ability to deny people's access to food.
On the 30th day of a historic government shutdown, the halls of the Capitol are not filled with good news. Now, the nation on pause waits for a signal that its leaders can find a path back from the brink. Let's find out what's the actual truth. In this latest development aimed at resolving the ongoing government shutdown, Senate Republicans have reportedly reached a tentative consensus to extend federal funding until the end of January. This emerging strategy, according to sources familiar with the closed-door negotiations, would see a temporary funding measure, known as a continuing resolution, set to expire on January 30th. The agreement, which solidified during a private conference meeting, represents a critical step toward reopening the government, though lawmakers acknowledge that internal discussions are continuing and not all members are fully aligned. This proposed January timeline, however, creates tension with the goals of senior appropriators from both parties, who had been advocating for a much shorter deadline in December. Their reasoning was that an earlier expiration would maintain maximum pressure on Congress to swiftly negotiate and pass a comprehensive, full-year funding package rather than repeatedly relying on temporary patches. The push for a longer extension into late January is seen as a victory for Republican leadership in both the Senate and the House, who have been privately working to secure more time for complex negotiations. For House Republican leaders specifically, the end of January date is currently viewed as one of the more viable options, standing in contrast to the demands from a faction of fiscal conservatives who are pushing for a stopgap measure that would last until next November, a move intended to enforce strict, flat funding levels across government agencies. Parallel to the stopgap discussions, Senate Appropriations Chair Susan Collins is leading efforts to finalize a package of 3 full-year funding bills. This legislative bundle is being prepared so that it could potentially be passed alongside the temporary funding measure for all other government agencies, creating a dual-path approach to ending the shutdown. While a fellow Republican senator expressed confidence that Chair Collins would soon conclude this work, he also leveled criticism at Democratic negotiators, accusing them of delaying a final agreement to reopen the government. This sentiment was echoed by another Republican senator who claimed that Democrats were moving the goalposts in the talks, pointing to a recent offer that linked the funding bills with a 1-year extension of expiring healthcare tax credits, a demand described as an absolute non-starter for Republicans. This political friction underscores the delicate and contentious balance that must be struck to achieve a bipartisan solution and restore full operation of the federal government. As the historic government shutdown stretched into its 38th day, a palpable sense of frustration filled the Senate chamber on Friday. In a stark demonstration of the deep partisan divisions fueling the stalemate, Senate Democrats blocked, for a second time, a Republican-backed bill designed to provide financial relief to specific groups caught in the crossfire. The legislation, proposed by Senator Ron Johnson, sought to guarantee pay for federal employees who are mandated to work without pay during the shutdown, as well as for the nation's active-duty military personnel. The procedural vote to advance the bill failed by a margin of 53 to 43, falling short of the 60 votes required to move forward. The outcome was almost entirely along party lines, highlighting the political impasse. However, the Democratic opposition was not unanimous. 3 Democratic senators broke ranks to support the measure, signaling a flicker of bipartisan concern for the well-being of affected workers and service members. The Democratic caucus's overwhelming rejection of the bill was not rooted in a lack of sympathy for those going unpaid. Instead, their opposition was strategic and philosophical. Party leaders argued that the bill, while appearing to offer a temporary solution, would ultimately empower President Donald Trump to selectively decide which segments of the federal workforce receive their paychecks. They expressed concern that this would effectively allow the administration to mitigate the most visible public impacts of the shutdown. Following the failed vote, the atmosphere of uncertainty only deepened. Majority Leader John Thune moved to reconvene the Senate on Saturday, an unusual weekend session that underscored the urgency of the situation. Yet, The agenda for that meeting remained entirely in limbo, a reflection of the ongoing, behind-the-scenes negotiations. The entire Capitol now waits to see if these critical talks can finally produce the breakthrough needed to end the longest government shutdown in American history, or if the nation must brace for further political gridlock. In a significant strategic shift aimed at breaking the political deadlock that has shuttered the federal government, Senate Democrats have put forward a new, unified counterproposal that directly links the reopening of agencies to the fate of the nation's healthcare system. The initiative, championed by Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer in a well-attended floor speech that demonstrated strong caucus solidarity, offers a clear but contentious path forward. The Democratic proposal involves pairing a temporary spending bill to end the shutdown with a one-year extension of the Affordable Care Act's premium tax credits, which are otherwise set to expire on December 31st. This approach marks a deliberate change from their earlier position, which had demanded a permanent extension of these subsidies, indicating a willingness to compromise on duration to achieve an immediate resolution. Schumer framed the offer as a straightforward and reasonable solution, one that would simultaneously address the government closure and prevent an expected spike in health insurance premiums for millions of Americans. Crucially, the Democrats are proposing a clean extension of the tax credits, meaning it would not include the new eligibility restrictions that many Republicans have sought, a point that immediately became a central point of contention. To address longer-term concerns, Schumer also outlined a plan to establish a bipartisan committee tasked with negotiating a more sustainable solution for the subsidies and other potential healthcare reforms, but only after the government has reopened its doors. However, the Democratic leader's assertion that the ball is now in the Republicans' court was met with swift and firm rejection from key Senate Republicans. Majority Leader John Thune immediately dismissed the proposal as a non-starter, emphasizing the Republican position that the government must be reopened before any negotiations on healthcare can begin. While Senator Lindsey Graham voiced criticism on social media, arguing that a simple extension would primarily benefit insurance companies at the expense of consumers and taxpayers. This new Democratic stance emerged from hours of intense private meetings, revealing a coordinated effort to present a united front. The strategy was refined in a confidential gathering of roughly a dozen Democratic senators, including influential figures and potential swing votes, held in a Capitol basement office shortly before Schumer's public announcement. According to sources familiar with the private discussion, the collaborative and measured tone of this internal meeting stood in contrast to the more confrontational rhetoric often seen in public floor debates, suggesting a calculated and deliberate attempt to forge a viable path out of the crisis. Despite the show of unity and strategic adjustment, the immediate Republican dismissal signals that the deep ideological divide over healthcare policy continues to be the primary obstacle to ending the shutdown, setting the stage for a continued high-stakes political impasse. In a marked shift from the cautious optimism that had begun to circulate earlier in the week, the mood in the Capitol turned grim on Friday as the prospect of a prolonged government shutdown appeared increasingly likely. The stalemate hardened as Senate Majority Leader John Thune indicated in a brief interview that he would probably keep senators in Washington over the weekend, a move contingent on Democrats following through on their expected blockage of a House-passed stopgap funding bill. Thune's strategy revolves around using this specific bill as the foundational vehicle for any larger funding agreement, and he confirmed the Senate would likely take another vote to try and advance it in the coming days. This threat of weekend sessions underscores the significant hurdles that remain, dashing hopes for a swift resolution to the ongoing government closure. The core of the impasse lies in the fractured Democratic caucus, which finds itself divided between a growing frustration with the current shutdown strategy and a desire to continue fighting for key policy concessions. While some lawmakers had previously received signals that a critical mass of Democrats would be ready to vote to reopen the government by week's end, that scenario has failed to materialize. As a scheduled Friday vote on the Republican-backed stopgap looms, several Democratic senators have publicly stated their intention to oppose the measure. They are holding out for more concrete commitments from Republicans on central issues, including protections for soon-to-expire healthcare subsidies and the reinstatement of federal workers who were laid off during the shutdown. Despite this public show of resistance, there is private speculation among Senate aides that at least one additional Democratic vote could still be secured by Republicans. a possibility that Thune himself met with public skepticism, noting that Democrats must ultimately decide whether they wish to prolong the standoff or end it. Amidst the public posturing, a potential framework for a compromise has been taking shape behind the scenes through a series of bipartisan negotiations. The general outline of an agreement would involve passing 3 full-year funding bills covering veterans programs, food aid, and other critical areas, paired with a stopgap measure to reopen the rest of the government until at least late December. Republicans have reportedly offered assurances that Democrats would receive a Senate floor vote on the expiring Affordable Care Act subsidies once the government reopens. And they have also opened the door to discussions about rehiring the federal workers let go during the impasse. However, the path to finalizing this deal remains uncertain. The shutdown is no longer a temporary disruption, but a sustained state of affairs. And for more deep dives into the stories behind the news, make sure to subscribe.